I'm delighted to be joined today with Steve Baughman, the author of the 2018 book Cover Up in the Kingdom, Phone Sex Lies, and God's Great Apologist, Ravi Zacharias. I had Steve on about a month or two ago, and we were talking about Ravi Zacharias and kind of an update on that. Today, we're going to have a very different conversation. We're going to have an informal banter about Steve's reasons for not being a fundamentalist Baptist, or at least not being a
Anymore.
Christian. Yeah. And then
Thanks
yeah,
for
so we don't
having
have
me,
any
Randall.
agenda, but thanks for joining
Okay.
us, Steve. So yeah, you're going to give an opening statement, kind of your
Oh,
general view.
okay. Yeah. So what I think about why I'm no longer a Christian, I grew up profoundly passionate about the Southern Baptist evangelical Christianity I'd grown up with, always in a state of tension with it, always anguished about not really believing it, despite my most profound born again commitment years. I still had this still small voice saying, it ain't true, it ain't true. And I never could shake it. So when I was in my early 20s, I just said, I got to be honest with myself. I can't keep pretending to believe this. And so I stopped pretending, and I'm still there. Um, but when I think of the meta reason, like if I were standing before God, I would do what Bertrand Russell said and said, "Sorry, God, you didn't give us enough evidence." But I'd put it a little more nuanced than that. I would point to my own personal experience of desperately wanting the religion that I grew up believing to be true. I wanted Jesus to be risen, the Lord and the Lord of my life. I wanted all that stuff very passionately. And I prayed for it. I studied the Bible. I anguished over it. And uh, I never got over the doubts. And it just seems to me like, given the fervence of my plea and my search, that a perfect being who also wanted to be in relationship with me would have responded uh, in some way that I could see was a response. Now, so that's the big picture. I get there's lots of apologetic, fortune cookie level pithy statements like, "Oh, you're trying to tell God what to do." And I'm not really, I'm just saying that when I sit back and look at the way the world is, I cannot escape the powerful intuition that if the perfect God of Christianity existed, this world would be a very different place in many ways, including in my own search. So there I am.
Okay. First question. So you said this really happened in your early 20s. Are you saying that the what you're now giving us, is it, will you have confidence that that's an accurate description of your process in your early 20s, or is this looking back on it years, decades later, that this is now where you're at? And if the latter, then has there been development between your 20s and where you are now?
Well, the state of doubt, I remember as a one of my first times in Sunday school, I was probably 7 or 8 years old, hearing that he lives, Christ Jesus lives today. And then the big old clincher line at the end, "You ask me how I know he lives within my heart." And I just thought, that is the dumbest answer. How do I know Jesus lives? Well, because he lives in my heart. And even as a 7 or 8 year old, I was turned off by that. And that dynamic has never changed in my life. There were times when I was a pretty strong believer, but I never escaped the doubt. And even after I quit pretending to believe in my 20s, I've still gone, wax and wane. Sometimes I find it more plausible than others. So that's been the process since the beginning.
When you're doing that song, it's like I that's in my DNA from like 40 years ago. So yeah. He walks with
Okay.
me and talks with me. It's like right there.
Long
I'm
life
right there.
has no way. Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
got a million of them.
Um, let me defend that at least minimally for the devil's advocacy. So what well, and to seal man it. So the one reason to say he lives within my heart, and a parallel for that would be if a moral skeptic said to me, "Well, how do you know that there is any objective moral good in the world there's a sense where I would say it lives within my heart, meaning I just fundamentally perceive that there is moral good and moral evil, that there are things you ought to do and things you ought not to do, that there is objective moral value and disvalue in the world. And any argument you would give me for moral skepticism would likely not be stronger than the very fact that I have this sense of perceiving in a properly basic way moral good and evil. And similarly, one can say that there's a sense where you can know more than you can say. Let's say when it comes to relationships, how do you know that
Mhm.
person loves you, right? How do you know? And you could just say, well, I just know it in my heart. The connection that we have, something like that. And so that this person is then appealing to say more fundamental than the ability to provide arguments, abstract arguments, is a fundamental encounter with the living God. Now, this doesn't necessarily help you if you haven't had that experience, but could that be a valid response for a person who believes they do have that experience?
Yeah, and this is of course planting as a basic belief idea, and um, I speak primarily about me. It didn't work that way with me. I also would push back a little bit and raise underdetermination on your very fine example about I just feel these moral truths in my heart. I know that it's objectively wrong to torture puppies. And I would not go from that powerful feeling that there's something wrong with torturing puppies to therefore there are objective moral truths. As long as there's a naturalist, evolutionary, biological explanation for why I have this aversion to puppy torture, um, I would go with that before I start positing these mysterious metaphysical properties and of right and wrong. Does that make sense? Like I have this strong aversion to puppy torture. It makes me feel icky gooey, and I join the communal lingo and saying it's wrong, but I actually know that it's not. I don't think these are about metaphysical properties. There's something purely natural and less exotic that goes on around why I have this aversion to puppy torture.
You can have that view. I would just hope that you would appreciate that view is not a simpler or more intrinsically intuitive view than the view that begins by taking the primacy of objective morality. And let me just give you an analogy here. So, one person, let's say George Berkeley in the 17th century, 18th century. So, see, he argues that we don't actually experience the external world. What we experience
Mhm.
are what we could call like sense perceptual experiences in our mind. But he says that doesn't require us to posit that there is an external world, an objective, physical, extended world with physical properties that we are experiencing. All we need is a commitment to a sort of phenomenal reality where there are minds and the sensory states of the experiences of those minds. And so he could say that is simpler than positing an additional external world. For Berkeley,
Mhm.
the positing of of a world that we experience that is physical is analogous to what you're saying in terms of experiencing objective metaphysical moral properties that are objective. And what I'm saying is whether you're George Berkeley or Steve Baughman, you could take that view, but appreciate that other people are going to find it more plausible to believe there is an external world that they are encountering and that there are objective moral values in that world that they are encountering. And so neither does the phenomenological reductionism of Berkeley take natural precedent, nor does your naturalism take natural precedent.
Yeah, the difference I think would be that um, you and I go have a beer together. You get up to go to the bathroom. When you come back, your beer's empty. Um, I tell you, an angel came down and vaporized it because you're drinking too much, Randall. And you think that I drank your beer. How do we evaluate those theories? I would prefer your view that I drank your beer over anything that involves supernatural stuff. The metaphysics, if there's an it's not when I say it's a simpler route to the biological evolutionary explanation of our aversion to say puppy torture. I'm not saying it's a simple process. I'm saying it's less metaphysical. There's less philosophical speculation that goes into it. I think we can make a case just in terms of natural selection and evolutionary biology as to why we have these aversions to seeing things tortured. And I don't see room, I see not only the need for the metaphysical properties, but I also have never been able to figure out what exactly they mean. What exactly does it mean when you say it's wrong to torture puppies? And without that, I think there's no discussion to be had, right? You got to tell me what it means for it to be wrong to torture puppies.
Uh, I want to say a beer joke, as you just mentioned beer. So this is going to be a brief aside. So this guy, say he goes into the bar every day and he orders 3 pints, and he'll take a sip from one and then the other and then the other. And then one day the bartender asks, "How come you always order 3 pints at once?" And he says, "Well, I got two brothers, and we always used to go to the bar together and drink. And now they live in different cities. So what I do is I go out and I have, it's like I'm having drinks with them, and I, just have 3 beers, like we're drinking together." And the bartender thinks, "Oh, that's really nice." And then one day he comes in, and he only orders 2 beers. And then the bartender says, "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss." And he says, "Oh, no, no, I gave up beer." Ah,
That's good. I
okay.
like that.
Yeah. Anyway, we could talk all day about that, but I
Yeah.
will just say that I think, like, so you said a few things. One of them is, well, you don't even know what it means to use moral language. I would question that kind of semantic skepticism. I think we all have a good primary intuitive sense of what it means when we say you ought not do that. That is morally wrong. That is evil. Or that is good. You ought to do that. That's morally right. I think we all do have a sense of what that means. It's no more complicated than saying I'm sense perceiving the world out there. Because if you actually look at theories, philosophical theories of sense perception, they're whether it's an adverbial theory or a theory of appearing or something else, they are all enormously a sense data theory. They're all enormously complex and hard to understand. But there's something more primary than the philosophical theories, whether it is of moral perception or of sense perception, and that is actually morally perceiving or sense perceiving. So that takes primacy. And even if you don't have a satisfactory theory of one or the other, it doesn't mean it's hocus pocus or supernatural or something else. We could talk all day about that, but fair enough. I get a sense of where you're at there. I want to talk about doubts. Is that okay? So you mentioned doubts. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering, thinking back to like the 20s, your 20s, doubts were an issue for you, you said. I'm wondering if we could get in a time machine, if you had been raised in a Christian
Mm.
climate in which doubts were just considered a natural part of the environment and even a healthy expression of a lived and growing Christian faith, that one has doubts, do you think that might have changed how you processed your doubts at the time?
Yeah, interesting question. And this is one of the things I've benefited most from your writings, and I have quite a few of your books. And you point out that a lot of this rabid atheist stuff that we see on social media is people rebelling from a particular brand of Christianity, a particularly not very credible brand of Christianity, a sort of biblical literalism, inerrancy, Southern Baptist kind of stuff that I grew up with. Yes, if I had been raised open-minded Episcopalian or something like that, would I be on the same journey I am right now? Probably not. I don't know that I would still be a theist, but I mean, it's very hard to say, but I recognize that my aversion to a lot of Christianity is to this particularly narrow evangelical hardline view. That said, I still find it, because of the general problem of hiddenness of God, and especially the personal problem of hiddenness of God in my own experience, I still find it hard to believe in any God who actually wants to be in relationship with us. Not just with me, but with the 14-year-old Tibetan yak herder who doesn't have time to think about cool spiritual things because they're just trying to figure out how to get through the winter. Um, where is God for those people? How? And I think it would take a lot of Procrustean hermeneutics to cram the Christian God into some model that says that 14-year-old yak herder is just as important as Randal Rauser and Steve Baughman is. And I don't see how I could make that case intellectually. But Show me where I'm wrong.
Well, I don't think it's that Procrustean. It is perhaps if one begins with a sort of narrow exclusivism that says, for example, that relationship with God can only begin when one affirms or assents to a particular set of propositions, like
Yeah.
Jesus is Lord, God raised him from the dead, Romans 10:9. So if a person says, well, you can only have a relationship with God, something you can only have it if you have first assented to those things. And then you have the problem about 14-year-old yak herder who's never had an opportunity even to learn those propositions, let alone to assent to them. That creates all sorts of problems. But if one has a broader, hopeful, and inclusivist theology that recognizes God can be present through, let's say, for example, the universal logos, that Christ is not only Jesus, the man incarnate, but he's also that living Lord of the universe in whom all things hold together, Colossians 1:15-20, and that God can be present in many ways through that logos that all point ultimately to Jesus, but doesn't need to begin with assenting to propositions about Jesus. That offers you all sorts of different avenues. But let's talk about divine hiddenness. So I heard this as a clear theme here that if there were a God, God would be more visible. So I'll give a simple response to that. Um, the idea being that God can have, well, let's put it this way. So if we uncouple from that narrow exclusivist view that says you can only have a relationship with God, a meaningful salvific relationship, etc., once you've assented to propositions, doctrinal propositions about Jesus, something like that. Once you uncouple from that, um, then it opens up the possibility that people could be in relationship with God in various ways, even when they sense God as being hidden.
Mhm.
Now, this is going to sound trite, perhaps, but there's still some wisdom in it. If you go into your typical Christian bookstore and you, assuming there are any left, I mean, there's so many of them have closed because everything's sold at Walmart and Costco now, but assuming you can find a Christian bookstore and they sell a footprints plaque, of course, the story behind footprints is that the person looks over their life and they see two patterns of footprints, God and the human being. But then every time things are most difficult, there's one set of footprints, and the person says, God, where were you in those most difficult times? And he says, I was carrying you. Now, that
Mhm.
sounds in some respects very cloying and not something I would want to buy for my office wall. Having said that, there could be a wisdom there that even in the moments when it senses God is most far distant from us, God is, in fact, in retrospect, most closely present to us. Could that be a way of reframing some of your skepticism about divine hiddenness?
I would say that's important if true. I'm not trying to be snide, but yeah, that kind of hidden God carrying me through difficult times, it's not logically impossible. I don't find myself drawn to believing that when I have more naturalistic accounts, much simpler accounts, like Randall, I drank your beer, it wasn't an angel. I will always prefer those kinds of explanations, and I don't see a God doing that in my life. Not that God would do it in a way that I can see, but I don't see it. Um, and as hard as I tried to see that stuff, it never happened. And I'm getting along with a fairly coherent worldview without needing to use God to explain stuff. That's working very well for me. I mean, in terms of getting through life, could I be wrong? Yes. Um, but and the soteriology thing you talked about, I get that salvation, maybe you don't have a bunch of propositions that you assent to and then you get baptized and you're saved. But what I call the official holy documents of the Christian religion, the New Testament, um, is pretty unclear about what we have to do to be saved. I mean, there's plenty of passages saying believe, believe. Well, what do I believe? That implies, if not a set of propositions, it implies some sort of cognitive assent to something that has to be propositional. Otherwise, I don't know what I'm assenting to. So bottom line is that soteriology in the official documents is kind of a mess, which is why you guys keep disagreeing about it. And it seems to me like a real God who had such an important message for us humans, that he came down to earth and got tortured to death for it, would have made that message very clear. Instead, we see wars over salvation dogma. We see different seminary departments still trying to have their best hermeneutics and exegetes, figuring out what the hell we have to do to be saved. And that just strikes me as not an indication of divine involvement in salvation doctrine. I mean, it's such a human way to do things, and I'm not criticizing it. It's not their fault that there's no God, but it's not my fault either for not seeing God in that soteriology picture. Does that make sense?
So I promise is my last joke. Um, so this ship arrives on a desert island, and you probably heard this one too. I don't have a lot, and there's three grass huts. Two of them have crosses on
Mhm.
them. One guy's living on the island. So then the people ship ask this guy who's been shipwrecked on that island for who knows how many years. So what are those grass huts? And he says, well, the first one is my house, and the second one with the cross is the church I go to. And then they ask, well, and what's the third grass hut with the other cross? And he says, that's the church I used to go to. Anyway,
You know,
uh,
one of the nice things about my memory not being so good is I can hear jokes again, and the punchline is always fresh and new. I do remember that one.
exactly. Yeah. Um, so uh, you've raised another issue there, which related to that. Justin Schieber, my co-author in the book we wrote a few years ago, An Atheist and a Christian Walk into a Bar, talks about the problem of massive theological disagreement. I would say what in my book, The Doubter's Creed, and also in the most recent video, actually, I posted before this one on my YouTube channel, I said, let's define mere Christianity, first of all, in primacy, not in terms of doctrinal assent, but rather in terms of what I'm going to you call covenant fidelity. In other words, the practice of loving God and neighbor, where the love of neighbor becomes the model for the love of God. So I would
Mhm.
say it to me, the primacy actually is, do you love your neighbor as yourself? And everything kind of
Mhm.
flows from there. But yeah, I certainly get what you're saying, and those problems are multiplied with particular views.
Mhm.
And yes, your skepticism is certainly, I think, reasonable. I want to turn to one last question here, and maybe one quick follow-up as well before we conclude. But here it is. So you were talking about your skepticism about a perfect God. As you know, there are many models in theology of the divine in which perfection is pared down. So whether it is God is lacking in omniscience as conventionally understood, or God's not omnipotent as conventionally understood, or even God's not perfectly good as conventionally understood, that in some way, some of the tensions that you're raising and objections you're raising could be addressed through a modified understanding of the divine. Do you think there's any increased plausibility in any of those theologies?
Yeah, I mean, the less perfect you make God, the more consistent he is with the way the world is. I mean, in my view. So sure, make God more of a someone who's not quite omnipotent and maybe a process kind of being. It might make it, but all those adjustments create other problems. It's sort of like a big whack-a-mole game I find with Christian theology, and same thing with I'm a lawyer. Same thing with constitutional law. You solve one problem and you create another. So, but yeah, if God were if there was some plausible account for why God allows so much suffering, or let's say why there's so many unreached people. I find William Lane Craig's stuff on this fascinating and terribly implausible. You know, the whole Molinist account about God creating people and putting them in spaces where they won't hear the gospel because they wouldn't have accepted it anyway. You know, this gets a little bit to be sort of untethered speculation to solve so many of these problems. And that to me is, if I step back, that's another problem with Christianity for me, is that every issue, I mean, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I'm reasonably bright for the most part. I get so muddle-headed when I start delving into the technical issues. I mean, if I read Craig on the resurrection, I think the resurrection is pretty likely. Then I read Crowson on the resurrection. I think it's not likely. These issues get so extraordinarily complicated. It becomes an issue of which experts are we going to put our faith in ultimately. And that's the way we go through life, but I don't think we'd have to make decisions that way if there were a perfect God wanting to be in relationship with us. We wouldn't have to figure out who the good experts are, the ones we can trust, you know?
Okay, I'm gonna do a bit of a pushback and then segue to a final follow-up question. And my pushback is, let me see how to put this. So, you heard the term Alvinize?
Yeah, but run the meaning by me. It's a planting
So,
a thing.
yes, yes, it is. Daniel Dennett, years ago, 40 some years ago, of course, he's now passed on.
Yes.
He made this philosophical dictionary, satirical dictionary, where he coined a bunch of terms that were based upon contemporary philosophers, and one of them was based on Alvin Plantinga. And he coined the verb to alvinize, and to alvinize was my here's my colloquial or my paraphrase of it. He says to alvinize is to like stun a person into silence by making some extraordinarily implausible but logically possible claim, such as the reason that there is natural evil in the world is because God allows demons to create earthquakes, which was actually one of the things Flanagan proposed as theoretically possible when he was addressing the philosophical problem of natural evil. Uh, and so to Alvinize, then, well, here's the thing that I would want to say is Alvinizing is not simply the thing that Christians do when they're propping up theism, but it's something that everybody does with respect to developing a belief system or a philosophical proposition or a theory that other people just don't find to be within their plausibility framework. So Daniel or David Lewis was a famous philosopher who developed a theory of possible worlds where he said all possibilities are concrete. In other words, they're actualized themselves. So there is a possible world where you're a traveling salesman selling bottles of Heinz ketchup and driving a 64 Ford pickup truck to do it. There is an actual world in which you do those things. And that was part of his philosophical theory. And he said that the most common response to his theory of concrete possible worlds is people look at him like in stunned silence, which I would say is exactly like Alvinizing, except that David Lewis wasn't a Christian theist. He was talking about a theory of metaphysical possibility. So you can Alvinize anybody if they don't buy into your basic philosophical project. And to relate that, I would say that naturalists do this all the time as well. So when they're developing theories of naturalism, for example, trying to explain conscious states by saying, oh, they're actually just brain states. They're just material brain states. And the perception of them being conscious and being irreducible to the material is a user illusion. I mean, these are the kinds of
Mhm.
claims you'll often find among reductive naturalists or materialists. That alvanizes me. So
Mhm.
only thing I would say is that it's a two-way street, is that everybody's going to alvinize everybody else at some point if they don't accept the basic plausibility of the theoretical framework that the other person is working with. Fair?
And 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 I very very fair. And I am the first to admit, as I do often with my fellow atheists on social media, is there are some claims that are pretty more that the Christians have a better account for than we do. Like for instance, you mentioned I think consciousness and why is there something rather than nothing are if I had to put I'd put two points in the Christian column on that. And I have no problem granting that. And I wish more atheists were able to say, you guys aren't all stupid because you believe in God, which it's talk about saying something stupid, you know. But the issues are extraordinarily complex, and we should all try and avoid blowing people away with our implausible speculations because there are good arguments for theism. I just happen to not buy them, but they're there, and there's smart people like you. By the way, your chapter on massive theological disagreement has been underlined a zillion times. I wanted to pull it out before our discussion. It's very, very thought provoking. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. That brings me to the last question then, or my follow-up, which is, I understand you're still studying theology at an academic level. So tell me more about what it is that compels you to continue that line of study.
Well, I've I've been interested in Christian apologetics and Christianity and philosophical truth my whole life, and I started taking classes again 20 years ago, conveniently with the Dominicans because they're right near where I lived in California. And I started getting interested in Aquinas. And I now want to get serious about figuring out Thomism and the Thomist Aristotelian tradition. So I'm enrolled in an online class, online master's program in Catholic philosophy. I told him, hey, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not even a believer. I'm a skeptic. But if you take skeptics, I'd love to enroll. So I'm in the master's program in Catholic philosophy right now. So it's very interesting because I always was more predisposed towards analytic philosophy, and the whole continental thing is like learning a different language. It's my head's
Don't
swimming.
tell Thomists that they're continental. That will not go over well.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I have to bite my tongue on that, but they are. So,
Well, okay. I think that the Thomistic scholastic method is in many ways more analytic, but it's definitely, I mean, it's based on a robust Aristotelian metaphysics. So it's certainly different than
yeah,
the typical analytic skepticism historically about metaphysics. Anyway, that is
good
excellent
point.
advice. I That is excellent advice. I wish that everybody would take the time to study in depth opposing views the way that you are doing right now. It's a wonderful exercise.
Yeah, well, I agree. More people should do it. The world would be a better place. We'd have a lot less acrimony if we actually learned what the other person is saying. One of my favorite things from Father Anselm Romola, one of my most beloved professors at the Dominican school, is it's easy to criticize. It's hard to understand. Yeah.
Ah, brilliant. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's an excellent point on which to end. So, Steve, thanks a lot. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Randall.